The dust-laden wind carried a desperate cry as Bethany Aldridge collapsed at the threshold of Silver Peak's only medical clinic. Her fever-ravaged body no match for the journey that had brought her there. "Please," she whispered to the stern-faced man standing in the doorway, his medical bag clutched tightly against his chest as if she might steal it. "I need help." It was 1876 in Silver Peak, Colorado, a mining town that had seen its share of fortune hunters and desperate souls. Bethany had arrived just 3 weeks prior, hoping to start anew as a schoolteacher after fleeing an unwanted marriage arrangement back east. Now, the influenza that had been sweeping through the miners' camp where she'd been boarding had taken hold of her too, Doctor. Marshall Good looked down at her with cold, calculating eyes. "Miss Aldridge, I believe I made myself clear when you first arrived. I don't treat your kind." "My kind?" Bethany's voice cracked with the effort of speaking. "I'm simply ill, Doctor." "Women who associate with those filthy miners bring nothing but disease and moral decay to this town," he said, his voice carrying down the street where several townsfolk had stopped to watch the scene unfold. "Perhaps, if you had accepted proper lodging with the Wilsons as I suggested, rather than staying at that camp with those immigrant laborers, you wouldn't find yourself in this predicament." The unfairness of his accusation burned hotter than her fever. Bethany had taken the only accommodation she could afford until the schoolhouse was ready, and her position officially began. The mining camp's families had welcomed her, grateful that someone was willing to teach their children letters and numbers in the evenings after her work sewing at the general store. "Those are good people," she managed, trying to push herself up from the boardwalk. "Hard-working families." "Please, the children need their teacher." "Then they should find one with better moral judgment," Dr. Good replied, stepping back and closing his door with a decisive click. Bethany's vision swam as she struggled to her feet. The street seemed to tilt beneath her, the buildings of Silver Peak's main thoroughfare blurring into a haze of brown and gray. She felt herself falling, heard distant voices shouting, and then strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. "Easy there, miss," came a low, gentle voice. "I've got you." Through fever-glazed eyes, she looked up to see a weathered face framed by dark hair, concerned blue eyes studying her with an intensity that might have made her blush under different circumstances. "Vaughn," he said simply. "Vaughn Hayes. Let's get you someplace safe." The tall cowboy lifted her as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest as he carried her down the street. Bethany tried to protest, to insist she could walk, but the words wouldn't come. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek and his quiet voice asking someone for help. Vaughn Hayes had not planned to stay in Silver Peak for more than a night. He delivered a small herd to the mine company's mess hall and intended to collect his payment and move on by morning. Silver Peak was just another stop on an endless journey for a man who'd spent the past 5 years drifting wherever the work took him. But the sight of the young woman collapsing outside the doctor's office changed everything. He'd witnessed the entire exchange from across the street where he'd been tying his horse, heard the doctor's cruel dismissal, and something inside him, something he thought had died years ago during the war, stirred to life. Now, seated beside the narrow bed in the back room of Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house, Vaughn watched the rise and fall of Bethany Aldridge's chest as she battled the fever that had taken hold of her. The elderly landlady had been more than willing to offer a room when Vaughn carried the unconscious woman to her door, explaining what had happened. "That pompous fool," Mrs. Whitaker had muttered, directing Vaughn to lay Bethany on the bed. "Calls himself a doctor but won't treat half the town because they don't meet his standards of propriety. Been that way since his wife left him for a miner 3 years back." Mrs. Whitaker had done what she could with cool cloths and herbal teas, but by nightfall it was clear that Bethany needed real medicine. Her breathing had grown labored, her skin burning with a fever that wouldn't break. "There's a proper doctor in Larkspur, Mrs. Whitaker told Vaughn as she changed the cloth on Bethany's forehead. "Good man, doesn't turn folks away, but it's 3 days' hard ride and in this weather." She glanced out the window where spring rain had begun to fall. Vaughn looked down at the young woman, her golden hair spread across the pillow, her face flushed with fever. He'd only caught a glimpse of her eyes before she lost consciousness, a clear, determined green that had somehow pleaded and demanded help all at once. What medicine would she need? He asked quietly. Mrs. Whitaker seemed startled by the question. "Well, quinine for the fever, I expect. And Dr. Carver in Larkspur has those new sulfa powders from back east. Works miracles for lung ailments, they say." Vaughn stood, his decision made before he even realized it. "I'll go." "Young man, there's a storm coming." "The mountain passes, I know these mountains," he interrupted gently. "Been crossing them since I was 16. If there's medicine that can help her, I'll bring it back." "But you don't even know her," Mrs. Whitaker said, studying him with curious eyes. Vaughn couldn't explain it himself, why the sight of Bethany being turned away had stirred such anger in him. Why her suffering mattered when he'd trained himself not to get involved in others' troubles. He only knew he couldn't ride away and leave her to die. "Someone should help her," he said simply. "Seems like that someone is me." Within the hour, Vaughn had gathered supplies from the general store, ignoring the curious glances from the shopkeeper as he purchased extra ammunition, dried beef, hardtack, and waterproof oilskins. His money pouch considerably lighter, he returned to the boarding house where Mrs. Whitaker had prepared a list of the medicines needed, along with a letter to Dr. Carver explaining the situation. "Take this too," the older woman said, pressing a small leather pouch into his hand. "It's not much, but it'll help pay for the medicines." Vaughn tried to refuse, but she insisted. "It's from all of us. The miners' families sent what they could when they heard Miss Aldridge was ill. She's been teaching their children, you know. Won't take a penny from those who can't afford it." Something twisted in Vaughn's chest at that, the realization that this woman he was risking his life to save was the kind who gave of herself without question. It only strengthened his resolve. He approached the bed once more before departing, looking down at Bethany's restless form. In her delirium, she murmured something about lesson plans and children waiting. "Hold on, Miss Aldridge," he said softly, though he doubted she could hear him. "I'll be back with what you need." The rain had turned to a steady downpour by the time Vaughn mounted his stallion, Thunderbolt. The big black horse snorted impatiently, sensing his rider's urgency. Mrs. Whitaker stood on the porch, clutching her shawl against the chill. "Godspeed, Mr. Hayes," she called. "And be careful. There's bandits in those foothills, not to mention the weather." Vaughn touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then spurred Thunderbolt forward into the gathering darkness. 3 days to Larkspur if the weather held. 3 days back. Nearly a week before he'd return with the medicine if he made it at all. As Silver Peak faded behind him and the mountain trail grew steeper, Vaughn pushed aside thoughts of what might await Bethany if he failed. He'd seen too much death during the war, lost too many people he cared about. He couldn't save them. But maybe, just maybe, he could save her. The first day of riding proved as challenging as Vaughn had anticipated. The spring storm unleashed its fury on the mountain trail, turning dirt to mud that sucked at Thunderbolt's hooves with each labored step. Twice they nearly lost their footing on slippery rocks, and Vaughn's muscles ached with the constant tension of keeping his horse balanced on the treacherous path. By nightfall, he'd covered less ground than he'd hoped. Finding shelter beneath an overhanging rock ledge, Vaughn established a meager camp, built a small fire with precious dry wood he'd packed, and tried to dry his soaked clothing while Thunderbolt grazed on sparse mountain grass nearby. As he chewed on dried beef and hardtack, Vaughn found his thoughts drifting to Bethany Aldridge. What kind of woman travels alone to a mining town to teach children others might overlook? Someone brave, he reckoned. Someone with convictions. In his years of drifting, he'd met few people who put others before themselves. The war had stripped away his belief in humanity's goodness. 4 years of bloodshed, followed by 5 years of wandering from town to town, taking whatever honest work he could find. Breaking horses, driving cattle, guarding shipments had left him hollow. He avoided attachments, declined invitations to Sunday suppers and town dances, kept his words few and his expectations low. Yet here he was, risking his life for a woman whose voice he'd barely heard, whose story he didn't know. The irony wasn't lost on him as he spread his bedroll on the damp ground and tried to find sleep, while rain continued to drum against the rocks above. Dawn brought marginal improvement in the weather. The heavy rain had subsided to a persistent drizzle, though dark clouds still hung low over the mountain peaks ahead. Vaughn set out early, pushing Thunderbolt as fast as the terrain would allow, stopping only when necessary to rest his horse or consult his map. By midday, he'd reached Elk Pass, the highest point of the journey. From there, the trail descended sharply toward the next valley. Under normal circumstances, it would be an easy ride down. But the storm had transformed the path into a slippery chute of mud and loose stones. Leading Thunderbolt by the reins, Vaughn carefully picked his way down, testing each step before committing his weight. They had descended perhaps halfway when a sound froze him in place, the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked. "That's far enough, friend," came a rough voice from behind a stand of pines. "Hands where I can see them." Vaughn slowly raised his hands, keeping his grip on Thunderbolt's reins. 3 men emerged from the trees, each armed, their clothes mud-spattered and worn. Road agents, bandits who preyed on travelers in these isolated mountain passes. "I don't have much money," Vaughn said calmly, assessing his options. His revolver was holstered at his hip, but he'd never draw before one of them shot him. The leader, a bearded man with a jagged scar across his left cheek, stepped forward. "Let us decide what's worth taking." His eyes went to Thunderbolt, a fine horse worth more than everything else Vaughn carried combined. "The horse isn't for sale," Vaughn said, his voice hardening despite the danger. Without Thunderbolt, he'd never reach Larkspur in time. "Ain't looking to buy," the leader sneered. "Clem, check his saddlebags." The shortest of the 3 men approached cautiously, his pistol trained on Vaughn as he rifled through the saddlebags. He pulled out the oilskin-wrapped package of food, Vaughn's ammunition pouch, and the small leather bag containing the money from Silver Peak's residence. "Just trail rations and about $20, Clem reported, sounding disappointed. "What's your business out here in this weather?" the leader demanded, eyeing Vaughn suspiciously. Vaughn considered lying but decided against it. "I'm heading to Larkspur for medicine. There's a sick woman back in Silver Peak who'll die without it." A flicker of something, perhaps doubt, crossed the leader's scarred face. The 3rd man, who had remained silent, shifted uncomfortably. "Boss, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Deke," the leader snapped. "We need that horse. My brother's waiting for us in Riverton, and the law's probably not far behind." Understanding dawned on Vaughn. These weren't just opportunistic road agents, they were outlaws on the run. The situation had just become more dangerous. "Take the money," Vaughn offered. "Take the food." "But I need my horse and I need to get to Larkspur." The leader's laugh was harsh. You're not exactly in a position to negotiate. Vaughn's mind raced. He couldn't fail Bethany, not when her life depended on his return. That woman teaching children to read. Minors' children, immigrant children. The town doctor refused to treat her because he thought she was beneath him. He wasn't sure why he was telling them this. These men certainly had no reason to care, but something compelled him to continue. She's done nothing wrong except try to help those no one else would help. I barely know her, but I know she doesn't deserve to die because of one man's prejudice. A long silence followed his words. The leader's expression remained hard, but the one called Deke lowered his rifle slightly. "What's she sick with?" Deke asked, ignoring his leader's glare. "Influenza, from what I can tell. High fever, trouble breathing. The doctor in Larkspur has medicines that might save her, but only if I get there soon." Deke turned to his leader. "My sister died of the same thing last winter. Doc wouldn't come out to our cabin because Pa couldn't pay." Another tense silence fell. Finally, the leader cursed under his breath. "Keep the damn horse," he growled. "But we're taking the money and food." Relief flooded through Vaughn. "Take it, and take this too." He slowly reached into his shirt pocket and extracted his silver pocket watch, a keepsake from his father and one of the few valuable possessions he owned. "It'll fetch a good price." The leader snatched the watch, examined it briefly, then tucked it away. "Get going before I change my mind." Vaughn didn't need to be told twice. With a nod of acknowledgement, he mounted Thunderbolt and continued down the treacherous path, half expecting a bullet in his back at any moment. But none came. As the sound of hoofbeats faded behind him, Vaughn realized he'd have to push harder now, with no food and the day already half gone. But Thunderbolt was still with him, and the path to Larkspur lay ahead. He would make it. He had to. In Silver Peak, Bethany drifted in and out of consciousness, unaware of the cowboy's desperate journey on her behalf. Mrs. Whitaker remained steadfastly at her side, spooning broth between her cracked lips when possible, changing the cool cloths on her forehead, and watching with growing concern as the young woman's breathing became increasingly labored. Word of Dr. Good's refusal to treat the schoolteacher had spread throughout the mining camp and into town. On the second evening after Vaughn's departure, a delegation of miners and their wives arrived at Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house, bringing what remedies they could offer: herbal teas, honey for her throat, even a small bottle of expensive whiskey to ease her breathing. "We're grateful for all Miss Aldridge has done for our children," explained Mrs. Kowalski, whose husband worked the deepest shaft of the Silver Peak mine. "My Thomas can write his name now, thanks to her." Mrs. Whitaker welcomed their help, directing the visitors to leave their offerings and say brief prayers or well wishes without entering the sick room. "The fever might be catching," she warned, though several mothers insisted on helping anyway, taking turns sitting with Bethany while Mrs. Whitaker rested. On the third day, Dr. Good himself appeared at the boarding house door, medical bag in hand and expression grim. "I've come to check on Miss Aldridge," he announced when Mrs. Whitaker answered his knock. The elderly woman blocked the doorway, arms crossed over her chest. "Have you now? After turning her away when she came to you for help? After forcing that young cowboy to ride through a storm to Larkspur because you were too full of pride to do your duty?" Dr. Good's face flushed. "Several town council members have expressed concern about my decision." "You mean they threatened your position when they heard what you did?" Mrs. Whitaker said sharply. "Well, Mr. Hayes should return tomorrow or the next day with real medicine from a real doctor. Until then, we're managing as best we can without your help." She began to close the door, but Dr. Good put his foot in the jam. "Mrs. Whitaker, please." If Miss Aldridge dies before that cowboy returns, it will be on my conscience. At least let me examine her." Something in his voice, remorse perhaps, or fear, made Mrs. Whittaker hesitate. After a moment's consideration, she stepped aside. "You can look at her. But if you have nothing helpful to offer, you'll leave immediately." Dr. Good nodded and followed her to Bethany's room, where the young teacher lay shivering despite the warm blankets piled atop her. Her cheeks were flushed with fever, her breathing shallow and ragged. After a thorough examination, Dr. Good sat back, his expression grave. "The infection has settled in her lungs without proper medication." He trailed off, then opened his bag and removed several small bottles. "This is laudanum for the pain. This tincture might help reduce the fever somewhat. But what she really needs is what Mr. Hayes has gone to fetch," Mrs. Whittaker finished for him. "Will your remedies keep her alive until he returns?" Dr. Good couldn't meet her eyes. "I can only hope so, Mrs. Whittaker. I can only hope so." As he administered the medication, Bethany stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment they were clear and focused, looking directly at the doctor. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dr. Good swallowed hard. "Yes, Miss Aldridge, I should have come sooner. I apologize." A faint smile touched her lips before her eyes drifted closed again. "The children, their lessons. Don't worry about that now," Mrs. Whittaker soothed, gently stroking Bethany's hair. "You just focus on getting well." After the doctor left, promising to return in the morning, Mrs. Whittaker sat beside Bethany's bed and took her hot, dry hand between her own weathered ones. "That cowboy is coming back with your medicine, dear," she said softly. "A man who'd ride out in a storm for a stranger isn't going to give up. You hold on just a little longer." Meanwhile, Vaughn had reached Larkspur late on the second day, pushing Thunderbolt to his limits after the encounter with the road agents left them without supplies. The small town was larger than Silver Peak, boasting several streets of businesses, a proper church with a steeple, and most importantly, a doctor's office with a shingle that read Abraham Carver, M.D. Despite the late hour, Vaughn pounded on the doctor's door until a light appeared in the window and a middle-aged man in a dressing gown peered out. "You know what time it is, sir?" Dr. Carver demanded as he opened the door. "I apologize for the hour," Vaughn said, removing his hat. "I've ridden from Silver Peak with an urgent need. There's a woman there with severe influenza, and the town doctor refused to treat her." Dr. Carver's annoyance quickly shifted to professional concern. Come in. Tell me about the patient's symptoms while I gather what you'll need." Vaughn followed him into a well-appointed office that smelled of antiseptic and herbs, explaining Bethany's condition as best he could based on what he'd observed and what Mrs. Whittaker had told him. He handed over the woman's letter, which the doctor read quickly. "Margaret Whittaker, doctor." Carver murmured. "I haven't seen her in years, but she was a capable nurse during the war. If she says this woman has pneumonia developing from influenza, I believe her." He moved efficiently around the room, gathering bottles and packets from various cabinets and explaining each one's purpose. "This is quinine for the fever. These powders contain the new sulfa compound. Mix 1 packet in water twice daily. This is for inflammation of the lungs, and this tincture will help her cough up the congestion." As Dr. Carver prepared the medicines, Vaughn's stomach growled loudly enough for the doctor to hear. The older man paused and looked at him more carefully, noting his mud-stained clothes and exhausted demeanor. "When did you last eat, son?" Vaughn hesitated. "Had some jerky yesterday morning. Ran into trouble on the trail. Bandits took my supplies." Dr. Carver's eyebrows rose. "You continued without food." "The lady needs her medicine," Vaughn said simply. The doctor studied him for a moment, then disappeared into the back of the house, returning with bread, cheese, and cold meat, which he set before Vaughn. "Eat while I finish preparing these medications. You'll do this woman no good if you collapse from hunger before you reach her." Vaughn ate gratefully while the doctor worked, packaging the various medicines with detailed instructions for each. When he'd finished, Dr. Carver named a price that was higher than Vaughn had expected, especially with no money from Silver Peak's residents. Without hesitation, Vaughn removed his spurs' silver inlaid pieces he'd won in a rodeo years before and placed them on the counter. "Will these cover it? They're genuine silver." Dr. Carver picked up one of the spurs, examining the craftsmanship. "These are worth more than the medicines." "Then consider the difference payment for your time and the meal," Vaughn said. "I just need to get these medicines back to Miss Aldridge." The doctor nodded, impressed by the cowboy's determination. "I'll add some food for your return journey as well." The weather's clearing, but it's still a hard ride back to Silver Peak. An hour later, Vaughn was back on the trail, his saddlebags now containing precious medications rather than the supplies he'd started with. Thunderbolt, rested and fed while Vaughn had consulted with the doctor, moved with renewed energy despite the late hour. They rode through the night, Vaughn pushing himself to stay awake despite his exhaustion. Every time his head drooped, he thought of Bethany Aldridge fighting for breath in that small room, waiting for medicine that might save her life. The image was enough to keep him upright in the saddle as stars wheeled overhead and the mountain path stretched endlessly before him. Dawn found him halfway back to Silver Peak, making better time without the storm hampering their progress. He allowed brief rests for Thunderbolt, dozing for 15 minutes at a time while the horse grazed, then pressing on with single-minded determination. By the afternoon of the third day of his return journey, the familiar outlines of Silver Peak appeared in the valley below. Vaughn felt a surge of hope as he urged Thunderbolt into a final effort, the big horse responding gallantly despite his fatigue. As they clattered down the main street, townsfolk stopped to stare at the mud-splattered, exhausted rider. Vaughn pulled up in front of Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house, nearly falling as he dismounted on legs stiff from days in the saddle. The front door flew open before he reached it. Mrs. Whittaker stood there, her face tight with worry that melted into relief at the sight of him. "You made it," she breathed. "Thank God." Vaughn held up the saddlebag containing the precious medicines. "How is she?" Mrs. Whittaker's expression grew somber. "Still with us, but only just. The doctor's been coming by, had a change of heart after you left, but he says without proper medicine." She shook her head. "You're just in time, Mr. Hayes. Perhaps just in time." Vaughn followed her into the house and up the stairs, his exhaustion forgotten in the urgency of delivering the medications. The room was dim, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. In the bed lay Bethany, her face waxen except for 2 bright spots of color high on her cheekbones. Her breathing came in labored gasps that seemed to take all her strength. A young woman Vaughn didn't recognize sat beside the bed, pressing a cool cloth to Bethany's forehead. She looked up as they entered, her eyes widening at Vaughn's disheveled appearance. "This is Jenny Kowalski, Mrs. Whittaker explained. "She's been helping tend to Miss Aldridge. Jenny, this is Mr. Hayes, the one who went for the medicine." Jenny stood quickly. "I'll fetch some hot water for the medicines." As she left, Vaughn approached the bed, unpacking the medicines and explaining each one as doctor Carver had instructed him. Mrs. Whittaker listened attentively, nodding as she examined each bottle and packet. "We'll start with the fever reducer and the sulfa compound," she decided. "Help me raise her up a bit so she can swallow." Vaughn gently lifted Bethany's shoulders, supporting her head as Mrs. Whittaker carefully administered the first doses of medicine. Bethany's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glazed with fever. "Water," she whispered. Vaughn reached for the glass on the bedside table and held it to her parched lips, allowing her small sips. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're going to be all right." Her eyes seemed to clear momentarily, focusing on his face with a question in their depths. "I'm Vaughn Hayes," he said softly. "I brought medicine from Larkspur. You're going to get better now." The faintest smile touched her lips before her eyes drifted closed again, but her breathing seemed less labored as they eased her back against the pillows. "You should rest, Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Whitaker said, noting how he swayed slightly on his feet. "You've done more than anyone could ask. I can manage the medicines now." Vaughn shook his head. "I'd like to stay if you don't mind, just until we know if the medicine is working." Mrs. Whitaker studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll have a cot brought in, and some food. You look half-starved." "Thank you," Vaughn said, settling into the chair beside Bethany's bed. "I just need to know she'll be all right." Mrs. Whitaker patted his shoulder as she passed. "You've given her the best chance possible, Mr. Hayes. The rest is in God's hands." Through the night, Vaughn drifted in and out of sleep in the chair, waking each time Mrs. Whitaker came to administer another dose of medicine. By dawn, signs of improvement were evident. Bethany's breathing had eased, and her fever had diminished slightly. Dr. Good arrived early, examining Bethany thoroughly before pronouncing the medicines effective. "Her body is responding well," he told them. "The fever should continue to decrease, and the congestion in her lungs is already beginning to clear." Vaughn watched the doctor from the corner, still wary of the man who had initially refused treatment. As if sensing his scrutiny, Dr. Good approached him after completing his examination. "Mr. Hayes, I understand I owe you an apology." Vaughn shook his head. "It's not me you need to apologize to." "You're right, of course," the doctor admitted, glancing back at Bethany. "I've already spoken to Miss Aldridge, though I'm not certain she was lucid enough to understand. My behavior was inexcusable." "Why did you refuse to help her?" Vaughn asked quietly, keeping his voice low to avoid disturbing Bethany. Dr. Good's shoulders slumped. "It's a poor excuse, but she reminded me of someone. My wife left me for a miner 3 years ago. Miss Aldridge's association with the mining camp." He shook his head. "As I said, inexcusable. I allowed personal bitterness to interfere with my oath as a physician." Vaughn said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them. Finally, the doctor straightened his coat and picked up his bag. "I'll return this afternoon to check on her progress. The medicines you brought may well have saved her life, Mr. Hayes. Not many men would have undertaken such a journey for a stranger." After he left, Vaughn moved back to Bethany's bedside. Her face was still pale, but the feverish flush had subsided, and her breathing came more easily. As he watched, her eyes opened clear and alert for the first time since he'd met her. "You're the cowboy," she said softly. "The one who caught me when I fell." Vaughn nodded, unexpectedly moved by the sound of her voice. "Vaughn Hayes, madam. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," she said with a weak smile. "Mrs. Whitaker told me what you did riding to Larkspur for medicine. I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks," he assured her. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," Bethany pointed out. "You did." She studied his face with those remarkable green eyes that seemed to see more than he was comfortable revealing. "Why, you don't even know me." Vaughn shifted in his chair, unsure how to explain what had driven him. "I guess I know what it's like to be judged unfairly," he finally said. "To be found wanting based on appearances or circumstances rather than who you are." Bethany nodded slowly. During the war, the question startled him. Few people guessed his past so quickly. "Yes," he admitted. "I fought for the Union." Came home to Texas afterward and found I wasn't welcome anymore. So you've been wandering ever since, she surmised, her insight uncanny for someone who just emerged from a fever. More or less. Taking work where I can find it. Bethany seemed about to say more, but a coughing fit overtook her, and Vaughn quickly helped her sit up, supporting her until the spasm passed. You should rest, he told her, easing her back against the pillows. The medicine is working, but you need to regain your strength. Will you stay in Silver Peak? She asked, her voice thin with exhaustion but her eyes still alert. At least until I'm well enough to properly thank you. Something warm unfurled in Vaughn's chest at her words, a feeling so unfamiliar he almost didn't recognize it as hope. I'll stay, he promised. You focus on getting better, Miss Aldridge. Bethany, she corrected, her eyes drifting closed. My friends call me Bethany. Rest well, Bethany, Vaughn said softly, but she had already slipped into a healing sleep. Over the next week, Bethany's condition improved steadily. The medicines from Larkspur worked exactly as Dr. Carver had promised, reducing her fever and helping clear the infection from her lungs. By the 5th day, she was able to sit up in bed for short periods, and by the 7th, Mrs. Whitaker declared her well enough for brief visits from the miners' children, who had been asking after their teacher. Vaughn found legitimate reasons to remain in Silver Peak. The livery owner needed help breaking some new horses. The general store needed protection for a shipment of supplies coming from Denver. The mining company was short a guard for the weekly gold transport to the bank in the next town over. Each job provided enough money to extend his stay, and each day he found time to visit Bethany. Their conversations began cautiously polite exchanges about her recovery, the weather, news from around town. But gradually, as Bethany grew stronger, they shared more of themselves. She told him about her life in Boston, her domineering father who had arranged her marriage to a business associate 30 years her senior, and her escape west with dreams of independence and purpose. Teaching was always my passion, she explained one afternoon as they sat on Mrs. Whitaker's small back porch, Bethany wrapped in a quilt despite the spring warmth. My father considered it a suitable occupation for an unmarried woman, but not for his daughter. When he announced my engagement to Mr. Holloway, I knew I had to leave. I couldn't bear the thought of being silenced, of living my life according to someone else's expectations. So you came to Silver Peak, Vaughn said. About as far from Boston society as you could get, Bethany smiled. I answered an advertisement for a teacher. The town council mentioned rustic conditions but promised a schoolhouse would be built by summer. When I arrived and found the schoolhouse was still just a frame with no walls, I had to find temporary work and lodging. At the mining camp, she nodded. Mrs. Kowalski offered me a place to stay with her family. In exchange, I started teaching the children in the evenings. They're so eager to learn, Vaughn. Some of them had never held a book before. The passion in her voice as she spoke about her students touched something in Vaughn, a reminder of what it meant to believe in something beyond mere survival. In turn, he found himself sharing parts of his past he rarely spoke of. His family's small ranch in the Texas Hill Country. His decision to fight for the Union despite Texas's secession. The way neighbors who'd once been friends had called him traitor when he returned, and his father's quiet suggestion that he might find peace elsewhere for a time. I thought it would be temporary, he admitted. A year or two of drifting, then I'd return home when tempers cooled, but 1 year became 5 and somehow I never found the right time to go back. Do you miss it? Bethany asked. Having a home, the question caught him off guard. He'd grown so accustomed to transience that he rarely allowed himself to consider what he'd left behind. Sometimes, he acknowledged, Mostly, I miss the feeling of belonging somewhere, of having a purpose beyond the next job or the next town. Bethany's hand covered his where it rested on the porch railing, a brief, warm touch that conveyed understanding without words. In that moment, with the late afternoon sun gilding her still pale face and the scent of Mrs. Whitaker's climbing roses filling the air, Vaughn realized he was in danger of losing his heart to this courageous, determined woman. The realization should have sent him running. Attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability inevitably led to pain, lessons the war and its aftermath had taught him well. Yet he found himself drawn more deeply into Silver Peak's life and into Bethany's orbit with each passing day. As Bethany regained her strength, she began to venture out more, first for short walks with Mrs. Whitaker or Vaughn supporting her, then increasingly on her own. The town's response to her recovery was heartwarming. Shopkeepers offered small gifts. Miners' wives brought home-cooked meals to aid her convalescence, and the children from the camp appeared regularly with wildflowers and laboriously written notes. Dr. Good, true to his word, had undergone a transformation of sorts. He visited daily during Bethany's early recovery, providing additional treatments to complement the medicines from Larkspur. More significantly, he had begun making weekly visits to the mining camp, offering basic medical care to families who previously had to manage without. "Your illness seems to have awakened his conscience," Mrs. Whitaker observed one evening as they watched the doctor depart after his final checkup. "Sometimes it takes a shock to make a man examine his prejudices." 2 weeks after Vaughn's return with the medicine, Mayor Wilson called a town meeting to discuss the completion of the schoolhouse. To Bethany's surprise, the town council had decided to expedite construction, with volunteers from both the town and mining camp working together to ensure it would be ready within the month. "We've been reminded of the importance of education for all our children," the mayor announced, nodding respectfully toward Bethany where she sat with Mrs. Whitaker, "and of the dedication of our new teacher, who has already begun her work despite challenging circumstances." A cheer went up from the assembled townsfolk, with the miners and their families joining in most enthusiastically. Bethany blushed at the attention but stood to express her gratitude, her voice strong despite her recent illness. "I look forward to welcoming every child in Silver Peak to our new school," she said. "Education is not a privilege for the few, but a right for all who seek it. Together, we'll build not just a schoolhouse, but a community where everyone has the opportunity to learn and grow." Her words were met with applause, and as she sat down, her eyes found Vaughn's across the room. He nodded slightly, a gesture of approval and something more, admiration perhaps, or a deeper emotion he wasn't yet ready to name. After the meeting, as people filed out of the town hall, Mayor Wilson approached Vaughn. "Mr. Hayes, I understand you're handy with carpentry as well as horses." Vaughn nodded cautiously. "I've built a few things in my time." "Excellent. We could use your skills on the schoolhouse if you're planning to stay in Silver Peak a while longer." The question hung in the air, not just about the schoolhouse, but about Vaughn's intentions. He was aware of the curious glances from townsfolk who had noticed his frequent visits to Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house, the walks he took with Bethany as her strength returned, the way he'd integrated himself into a community he'd initially planned to pass through. Before he could respond, Bethany joined them, her cheeks still flushed from the meeting's success. "Are you recruiting helpers for the schoolhouse, Mayor Wilson? Mr. Hayes is quite skilled. You should see the bookshelf he made for Mrs. Whitaker's parlor." The mayor smiled knowingly. "So I've heard. What do you say, Hayes? Can we count on you for the construction crew?" Vaughn looked at Bethany, at the hope in her eyes and the future she was building in this small mountain town. The decision, he realized, had already been made, perhaps from the moment he'd carried her unconscious form to safety. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll stay to help with the schoolhouse." The next few weeks passed in a flurry of activity. The schoolhouse construction proceeded rapidly with volunteers working from dawn to dusk. Vaughn found himself appointed as something of a foreman, his experience and calm authority earning respect from both townsmen and miners who might otherwise have struggled to work together. Bethany, fully recovered now, visited the construction site daily, offering suggestions for the classroom layout and bringing refreshments for the workers. She had moved from Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house to a small cabin near the schoolhouse site, provided by the town council as part of her teaching position. Each evening after work, Vaughn would walk her home, their conversations growing increasingly personal as they shared hopes and fears that neither had confided to anyone else. He told her about nightmares that still plagued him from the war. She admitted her fear that she might never measure up to the educational standards she'd known in Boston. "These children deserve the best," she said one evening as they sat on her small porch, watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk. "I worry that I'm not enough, that my knowledge is insufficient, that I'll fail them somehow." "You won't," Vaughn assured her, his hand finding hers in the dimness. "You care too much to fail. That's more important than any fancy education or teaching method." She turned to him, her face serious in the fading light. "Why did you really do it, Vaughn? Risk your life to bring medicine for someone you didn't know?" He was quiet for a long moment, searching for words to explain a decision that had seemed beyond question at the time. "When I saw how that doctor treated you, dismissing you because of where you were staying, who you associated with, it reminded me of everything I'd come to hate about the world. The way people judge and divide, deciding who's worthy and who isn't." He paused, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "And then I learned you were teaching children others overlooked, giving them a chance they might never have had otherwise. It seemed like the world needed more people like you." Bethany's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I think the world needs more people like you, Vaughn Hayes. People who act on their convictions, who help strangers without expectation of reward." The tenderness in her voice undid him. Without thinking, Vaughn leaned forward and kissed her gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. When they finally parted, both breathless, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "I should apologize," he murmured. "That was presumptuous." "It was perfect," Bethany countered, her fingers curling into his shirt. "And long overdue." From that evening forward, their relationship deepened into something neither had expected to find in Silver Peak. As the schoolhouse neared completion, they spent every available moment together, sharing meals, helping each other with various tasks, and gradually weaving their separate stories into a shared narrative. The town noticed, of course. Silver Peak was too small for secrets, especially ones involving the new schoolteacher and the cowboy who had risked his life to save her. But the community's response was overwhelmingly positive. Mrs. Whitaker declared they were perfectly matched, while Jenny Kowalski insisted she'd known they would fall in love from the moment she saw Vaughn return with the medicine. Even Dr. Good, during a chance encounter outside the general store, commented that Vaughn had earned the right to court Miss Aldridge, having proven his character beyond any doubt. The schoolhouse was completed by early summer, a sturdy structure with large windows to admit light and fresh air, handcrafted desks and benches, and a small bell tower topped with a bell donated by the mining company. The night before the official opening, Bethany and Vaughn walked through the empty classroom, her fingers trailing across the smooth wooden desks he had helped craft. "It's more beautiful than I imagined," she said, turning slowly to take in the whole room. "Every child will have a proper place to sit, books to read, slates to write on. And the best teacher in Colorado," Vaughn added, enjoying the blush that spread across her cheeks at his praise. Bethany moved to the large desk at the front of the room, her desk, and opened one of the drawers, removing a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I have something for you," she said, suddenly shy as she handed it to him. "A thank-you gift, though it hardly seems adequate." Vaughn unwrapped the package carefully to reveal a silver pocket watch, not unlike the one he had given to the road agents to secure his passage. "Bethany, this is too much. Mrs. Whitaker told me about your father's watch," she interrupted gently. "How you traded it for my medicine. I wanted you to have this to replace it." He stared at the watch, deeply moved by her thoughtfulness. "I don't know what to say." "Open it," she urged. Inside the cover was an inscription: "To Vaughn, who rode through storm and danger to bring healing. With eternal gratitude and love, Bethany." The word love shimmered on the silver surface, a declaration and a question all at once. Vaughn looked up to find Bethany watching him anxiously, waiting for his response. In that moment, all his reservations about attachment, all his hard-won caution, seemed to dissolve. This woman, brave, compassionate, and determined, had awakened something in him he'd thought lost forever: the capacity to hope, to build, to love. "Bethany," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I came to Silver Peak intending to stay one night. Now I can't imagine leaving, not because of this town or this schoolhouse, but because of you." He took her hands in his, the watch clasped between their palms. "I love you. I think I've loved you since I carried you to safety that first day, though I was too stubborn to admit it." Tears spilled onto Bethany's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. "I love you too, Vaughn Hayes, my cowboy medicine man." He laughed at that, then sobered. "I don't have much to offer beyond these two hands and a heart that's yours completely." "But if that's enough, it's everything," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "Everything I never knew I wanted until you brought it to me." They were married 2 weeks later in Silver Peak's small church with Mrs. Whitaker, the Kowalskis, and what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Bethany wore a simple white dress ordered from Denver, with wildflowers in her hair. Vaughn, in a new suit that still felt strange after years in trail clothes, watched her walk toward him with a sense of wonder that this extraordinary woman had chosen him, Dr. Good, who had become something of a friend during Bethany's recovery, served as Vaughn's best man, a gesture of reconciliation that meant much to Bethany. And Mayor Wilson, officiating the ceremony, spoke movingly about how their love story had helped unite the town and mining camp in ways no one had anticipated. "Sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead us exactly where we need to be," the mayor observed. "And sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal the true character of a community and of the individuals within it." As they exchanged vows, Vaughn held Bethany's hands in his hands that had nursed fever-stricken children, hands that had written lessons on makeshift slates in a mining camp, hands that had reached for his when she needed strength. He promised to cherish her, to support her dreams, to build a life worthy of her courage and compassion. And when the mayor pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers that erupted seemed to come from everywhere at once, from miners and merchants, from schoolchildren and their parents, from the entirety of Silver Peak united in celebration of a love that had begun with an act of mercy and grown into something that would sustain them all their lives. They moved into a small house near the schoolhouse, close enough for Bethany to walk to work each day, but with enough land for Vaughn to start a modest horse breaking and training business. He still took occasional jobs guarding gold shipments or delivering cattle, but increasingly he found satisfaction in building something permanent in Silver Peak, a home, a business, a future with Bethany. As the seasons changed and their first year of marriage unfolded, Silver Peak continued to grow and evolve. The mining camp gradually integrated with the town as prejudices eased and understanding grew. Dr. Good, true to his transformation, established a small clinic where he treated all patients regardless of their background or ability to pay. And the schoolhouse thrived under Bethany's guidance, with enrollment growing to include not just children, but also adults eager to improve their reading and writing skills. Vaughn sometimes assisted with practical lessons, teaching older boys about horse care or basic carpentry, finding unexpected fulfillment in passing on his knowledge. One crisp autumn evening, as they sat before the fireplace in their cozy home, Bethany placed Vaughn's hand gently over her still flat stomach. "I have news," she said, her eyes alight with joy. "By spring, there will be 3 of us." The emotion that swept through Vaughn was unlike anything he'd known before, a fierce, protective love mingled with awe and trepidation. He gathered Bethany into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, which, to him, she was. "A child," he whispered against her hair. "Our child." Bethany nodded, her cheek pressed against his chest where she could hear the steady beating of his heart. "Our future," she corrected softly, "one we built together." As the fire crackled and night descended on Silver Peak, Vaughn reflected on the strange, winding path that had brought him here, to this woman, this home, this life he'd never dared to imagine for himself. All because a town doctor had refused to treat a feverish schoolteacher, and something in Vaughn's weary heart had refused to accept such injustice. "What are you thinking?" Bethany asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "I'm thinking that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best," he replied, his hand still resting protectively over their unborn child. "If Dr. Good had treated you that day, I would have collected my payment and ridden out of Silver Peak without looking back. I would never have known what I was missing." Bethany smiled, understanding perfectly. "Then perhaps we owe him a debt of gratitude after all." "Perhaps," Vaughn agreed, kissing her forehead. "But I prefer to think that some things are simply meant to be, that no matter how many wrong turns we take, love finds a way to guide us home." As winter gave way to spring, and spring blossomed into summer, Bethany and Vaughn welcomed their son, Samuel, named after Vaughn's father back in Texas. The birth was difficult, but with Dr. Good's skilled care and Mrs. Whittaker's experienced assistance, both mother and child emerged healthy and strong. Vaughn, holding his son for the first time, marveled at the perfect tiny features and the surprising strength in those miniature fingers that curled trustingly around his own. "He has your eyes," Bethany observed from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "And your determination, I think. He fought his way into this world with such purpose." "But he has your heart," Vaughn replied, gently placing Samuel in her arms. "I can see it already, the same compassion, the same fierce love of life." As news of Samuel's birth spread through Silver Peak, visitors arrived bearing gifts and good wishes, handcrafted toys from the miners, baby clothes sewn by the women in town, books for when he was older from Bethany's students. Each gift represented not just congratulations but acceptance, an acknowledgement that Vaughn and Bethany were now integral threads in the fabric of the community. That summer, as Samuel grew stronger, Vaughn finally wrote to his family in Texas, sharing news of his marriage, his son, and the life he had built in Colorado. The reply came faster than he'd expected, a heartfelt letter from his father expressing joy at becoming a grandfather and extending an invitation for them to visit when Samuel was old enough to travel. "Your mother and I never stopped hoping you'd find your way," Samuel Hayes, SR, wrote. "Not back to Texas, necessarily, but to peace and purpose. It sounds like you found both, son, along with a woman worthy of your loyalty and love. We couldn't ask for more." With that letter, the last piece of Vaughn's fragmented past seemed to fall into place, completing the picture of the man he had become: husband, father, respected businessman, and valued member of a community that had once been nothing more than a temporary stop on an endless journey. As the years passed, Silver Peak continued to flourish, with Bethany's school at its heart. Vaughn's horse business expanded to include breeding quality stock, bringing welcome prosperity and recognition to the area. And their family grew with the addition of a daughter, Margaret, named for Mrs. Whitaker, who had become like a grandmother to Samuel. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Vaughn took Bethany to the spot where the schoolhouse stood, the building that had represented her dreams and his redemption. "You ever wonder what might have happened if Dr. Good had treated you that day?" he asked as they watched Samuel and Margaret playing in the schoolyard. Bethany considered the question, her hand secure in his. "I might have recovered sooner. The school might have opened earlier. But the heart of what matters us, our children, this community we've helped build, I believe that would have found a way to happen regardless." "How can you be so sure?" Vaughn asked, genuinely curious. She turned to face him, the same determined green eyes that had captured his attention in her fever-ravaged face now studying him with loving clarity. "Because some journeys are inevitable, Vaughn. Some hearts are destined to find each other, no matter what obstacles stand in the way." She smiled, touching his cheek with gentle fingers. A stubborn cowboy who would ride through storm and danger for a stranger was bound to win that stranger's heart, one way or another. Vaughn pulled her close, marveling at the wisdom in her words and the love that had transformed them both. From the schoolyard came the sound of children's laughter, a promise of the future they continued to build together. And as the sun set over Silver Peak, painting the mountains gold and crimson, Vaughn Hayes, once a drifter, now anchored by love, gave silent thanks for the strange twist of fate that had brought him here. To this town, to this woman, to this life that had become more precious and more fulfilling than any he could have imagined for himself. In the years that followed, their love story became something of a legend in Silver Peak, the tale of a doctor's refusal, a cowboy's journey, and the healing power of compassion that had united not just two hearts, but an entire community. And though Vaughn and Bethany would often smile at the embellishments that inevitably crept into the retelling, they never corrected the essential truth at its core: that love, once awakened, can overcome any obstacle and transform even the most wounded heart. That, after all, was the medicine that had truly saved them both.